The decision was made in the early hours of June 6, 1944, in a quiet command chain that stretched from Hitler's headquarters to the coastal defenses of northern France. At Calais, the guns remained silent. 18 German divisions, organized under the 15th Army, sat intact and motionless along the Channel coast. Their positions were fortified. Their armor was fueled. Their orders were clear. They were not to engage. They were not to redeploy. They were to wait. By dawn, reports were already arriving from Normandy. Paratroopers had landed inland. Naval gunfire was hammering the coast. Allied troops were coming ashore in large numbers. The scale of the operation was impossible to ignore. Yet the formations at Calais did not move. The decision was not tactical. No field commander at Calais weighed the situation and chose restraint. The order came from above, rooted in a belief already hardened into doctrine. Normandy was assessed as a diversion. The real invasion was expected elsewhere. German high command had committed itself to a single assumption. The decisive Allied blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. That assumption carried a second, more personal certainty. The main assault would be led by George S. Patton. As long as Patton had not appeared, the invasion could not be real. Intelligence summaries circulating in Berlin that morning repeated the same point. Patton remained in southeastern England. His headquarters showed no signs of movement. Radio traffic associated with his command continued at full volume. Nothing suggested his forces were committed. On that basis, the 15th Army was ordered to hold its ground. While Allied soldiers were being cut down on the beaches to the west, the strongest concentration of German combat power in France was deliberately withheld. Not because it was unable to act, not because it was unaware. It remained idle because the enemy it feared most had not yet revealed himself. That decision locked the German response into paralysis before the battle had fully begun. At that moment, the military opportunity was concrete, measurable, and fleeting. The German position in early June 1944 was not one of weakness in northern France. It was one of misallocation. The Wehrmacht still possessed the means to disrupt, and potentially break, the Allied landings if those means were applied quickly and decisively. The Allied invasion force at Normandy was exposed by design. Amphibious landings required congestion. Men, vehicles, and supplies were compressed into narrow beachheads with limited exits. Until ports were secured, everything depended on fragile logistics pushed across open sand. In the first hours, Allied units were isolated, understrength, and vulnerable to counterattack. German doctrine understood this clearly. The correct response to an amphibious assault was immediate concentration of mobile reserves, particularly armored formations, against the landing zones before the attacker could consolidate. Speed mattered more than perfection. Even partial disruption could cascade into collapse. That option existed. Within operational reach of Normandy were multiple panzer divisions, including experienced formations equipped with heavy tanks and self-propelled artillery. Their crews were trained for mobile warfare. Their commanders knew how to exploit confusion. A coordinated thrust against the American and British beachheads within the first 24 hours would have forced the Allies to fight inland battles before they were ready. The terrain favored such an effort. Normandy's hedgerows, villages, and narrow roads restricted Allied maneuver once forces moved off the beaches. Armor advancing from the east and southeast could funnel the invaders into choke points, limiting the advantage of naval gunfire and air support. Even limited German success would have delayed the Allied timetable and increased casualties to politically dangerous levels. Most importantly, the German command structure allowed this response, if authorization was granted. Field commanders in the West had already identified the danger. Senior officers understood that once the Allies established a firm lodgment, German options would narrow rapidly. They had requested freedom to move armored reserves without waiting for Berlin. Those requests had been denied. Instead, German planning before D-Day had committed to a single decisive counterstroke at the expected main landing site. That commitment was not irrational on its face. Pas-de-Calais was the shortest crossing from Britain. It offered direct routes into Germany's industrial heartland. If one assumed a single main invasion, Calais was the logical choice. But logic became rigidity. The opportunity at Normandy did not require full commitment of all reserves. Even partial redeployment of the 15th Army's strength, elements of its armor, infantry, or artillery, would have altered the balance during the invasion's most fragile phase. The Allies could not replace losses quickly in those first hours. German losses, by contrast, could be absorbed by depth and interior lines. What made the opportunity decisive was timing. By June 7th or 8th, Allied air superiority and naval firepower would dominate the battlefield. By June 10th, supplies would be flowing steadily. By June 12th, the invasion would be irreversible. The window for German success measured in hours, not days. That window was open on the morning of June 6th. Nothing in the battlefield situation prevented German movement. Roads were intact. Units were in position. Communications were functioning. The constraint was not material. It was conceptual. German leadership had already decided where the real battle would be fought. Normandy did not fit that decision. As a result, a rare strategic opportunity was allowed to expire unused, not because it was misunderstood by soldiers, but because it contradicted an assumption that had hardened into belief. The warning did not come from instinct or hindsight. It came from preparation, pattern recognition, and an understanding of the enemy's own fears. By the spring of 1944, German intelligence had reduced the Allied command problem to a single variable. Not where the invasion would land, not how many divisions would be used, but who would lead the decisive blow. Their answer was already fixed. George Patton. This was not sentiment or exaggeration. It was the product of 2 years of observation. German after-action reports from North Africa and Sicily had identified Patton as operationally dangerous in a way other Allied commanders were not. He moved faster than doctrine allowed. He accepted risk without seeking consensus. He exploited collapse instead of stabilizing fronts. Where others paused to reorganize, Patton accelerated. German planners understood what that meant in an invasion scenario. Amphibious landings required momentum. Any hesitation after landing would be fatal. The commander chosen to lead the main assault would have to exploit chaos immediately before defenders could react. Patton fit that requirement precisely. By early 1944, German intelligence officers were tracking his location obsessively. His movements were logged. His appearances were noted. His absence from active commands was treated not as demotion, but as concealment. They assumed he was being preserved for the decisive operation. That assumption hardened into expectation. When Patton was assigned no combat role in the visible preparations for Normandy, German analysts did not revise their conclusions. They reinforced them. If Patton was not involved, then Normandy could not be the main effort. The logic was circular, but internally consistent. The most dangerous Allied commander would not be wasted on a secondary landing. That belief became the warning signal the Germans trusted most. Not beach reports. Not radar contacts. Not parachute drops. Patton's location mattered more than all of it. What the Germans did not see was that Patton himself had already assessed the situation from the opposite side. Following the Sicily incidents, Patton had been removed from frontline command. He was humiliated publicly and constrained privately. But he was not excluded from planning. He remained deeply involved in understanding how the invasion would be perceived by the enemy. Patton understood German psychology because he had studied it deliberately. He read their doctrine. He anticipated their reactions. He knew how much weight they placed on decisive leadership and aggressive exploitation. He also knew they feared him personally, not symbolically. That fear was predictable, which made it usable. Patton recognized that his enforced inactivity created a paradox. The enemy believed he was too valuable to be sidelined. Therefore, sidelining him could be interpreted as deception. His presence in England, unattached to an obvious invasion force, would draw attention rather than reduce it. In private correspondence, Patton acknowledged what was happening. He understood that he was being positioned as bait, not for a tactical feint, but for a strategic fixation. His role was not to command troops, but to shape enemy decision-making. This was the warning the German command misread. They interpreted Patton's visibility as confirmation of future action. They interpreted his inactivity as preparation. They interpreted his continued radio traffic and ceremonial appearances as evidence of concealed strength. Every data point reinforced their expectation. Meanwhile, Patton prepared himself for 2 outcomes. Either the deception would work, or it would not. If it worked, German reserves would be held away from Normandy. If it failed, he expected to be blamed, not activated. What mattered was that the enemy had been conditioned long before June 6th to respond to Patton rather than to events. That conditioning was the real preparation. Not tanks, not ships, not divisions. By the time the invasion began, German leadership was no longer evaluating information neutrally. They were checking it against a single question that overrode all others. Where's Patton? Until that question had the answer they expected, every other warning was discounted. That was not an accident. It was the predictable result of a reputation built over years, weaponized in silence, and allowed to guide the enemy toward a conclusion that felt rational even as it became fatal. The overrule did not come as a dramatic intervention. It arrived as a series of quiet constraints that stripped field commanders of initiative while preserving the appearance of control. By June 1944, authority over German armored reserves in the West had been centralized to an extreme degree. The system was designed to prevent exactly what Normandy required: rapid, independent action. Panzer divisions were not instruments of local commanders. They were strategic assets, released only by the highest authority, and only for the battle that mattered most. That structure was political before it was military. Hitler distrusted his generals. He believed they lacked the will to see his strategy through. He had watched them retreat in North Africa, abandon positions in Italy, and argue for withdrawals he considered defeatist. In response, he concentrated decision-making in his own hands. No major redeployment of armored forces could occur without his approval. This ensured loyalty. It also ensured paralysis. In the weeks before the invasion, German command debates revolved around one question: where to commit the decisive reserve. The answer had already been shaped by intelligence assessments that emphasized Allied deception, false buildup, and the presumed logic of a Calais landing. Once that answer was accepted, everything else was subordinated to it. Normandy was classified as a supporting effort. Dangerous, but temporary. Something to be contained, not crushed. When reports of the landings arrived, senior commanders in the West reacted instinctively. They requested permission to move armored units toward the beaches. They understood the danger window. They knew delay would favor the Allies. Their assessments were clear and urgent. Those requests stalled in the system. At headquarters, the same reports were filtered through a different lens. Intelligence officers cross-referenced battlefield activity with strategic indicators. The most important indicator was not the scale of the landings. It was the absence of the figure they believed defined Allied intent. Patton had not moved. This absence mattered because it resolved an internal contradiction. If Normandy was the main invasion, why was the most aggressive Allied commander not leading it? If Patton was being held back, then Normandy must be a feint. That logic was emotionally satisfying to leadership that feared committing its last reserves prematurely. Fear drove caution. Caution was rationalized as discipline. The 15th Army, positioned at Calais, represented Germany's final operational insurance in the West. Once committed, it could not be reconstituted. If it moved, and the main Allied blow fell elsewhere, there would be no recovery. That risk loomed larger than the visible fighting in Normandy. Political pressure reinforced this hesitation. Hitler had repeatedly warned against reacting to Allied diversions. He cited earlier operations where the Allies had attempted to draw German forces away from decisive points. He believed patience, not reaction, was the key to victory. His staff echoed that belief. They framed restraint as strategic maturity. Any general urging immediate movement risked being labeled impulsive or panicked. Careers had ended for less. The result was an institutional bias against action. Orders flowed downward, emphasizing containment, observation, and readiness. Units were told to prepare for movement, but not to move. Commanders were instructed to await confirmation of Allied intent. That confirmation was defined narrowly. Patton must appear. This was the moment where military logic was explicitly subordinated to political control. Field commanders were not arguing over tactics. They were arguing over permission to act at all. Their authority had been hollowed out by a command culture that equated initiative with disobedience. The overrule was reinforced repeatedly throughout June 6th and the days that followed. Each new report from Normandy was weighed against the unchanged situation at Calais. Each delay in Patton's activation was treated as further proof of deception. By the time doubts began to surface, the system had locked itself into inaction. To reverse course would require admitting that the original assumption was wrong. That admission carried political risk. It implied that leadership had been misled, not by enemy brilliance, but by its own certainty. That was unacceptable. So the 15th Army remained in place. Its commanders waited. Its tanks sat idle. Its divisions preserved their strength for a battle that existed only in expectation. What made the overrule decisive was not a single order, but the cumulative effect of fear, ego, and institutional design. A system built to prevent mistakes had ensured one. Authority was centralized to eliminate uncertainty. Instead, it eliminated responsiveness. The decision not to move was defended as prudence. It was justified as strategic patience. In reality, it was the outcome of a command structure that valued control over adaptability and belief over evidence. By the time that structure began to crack, the opportunity it had denied was already gone. The consequences unfolded with mechanical clarity. On the beaches of Normandy, the Allied invasion survived its most dangerous hours not through superiority, but through absence. The German counterstroke that doctrine demanded never arrived, not because it could not, but because it was withheld. Throughout June 6th, German armored formations within striking distance of Normandy remained static. Orders were issued, revised, delayed, and reissued. Units prepared to move, then stood down. Fuel was loaded, then conserved. Commanders waited for authorization that did not come. The result was time. That time was purchased in blood on the beaches. At Omaha, American units came close to collapse. Small groups fought in isolation. Naval gunfire was called in at dangerously close range. Casualties mounted, but the Germans did not exploit the moment. No massed armor appeared inland. No coordinated thrust drove the invaders back into the sea. By the afternoon, the critical threshold had passed. Once Allied units secured exits off the beaches, the balance began to shift irreversibly. Engineers cleared obstacles. Artillery came ashore. Command structures stabilized. Air power, previously limited by weather and confusion, asserted itself with growing effect. What had been a fragile foothold became a defended lodgment. German commanders recognized the change almost immediately. Reports from Normandy described a deteriorating situation. Requests to release additional reserves grew more urgent. Each request was evaluated against the same criterion. Had the real invasion revealed itself yet? It had not. In the days that followed, the 15th Army remained fixed at Calais. Its presence there shaped every subsequent German decision in the West. Units were not merely idle. They were committed to waiting. Their mission was no longer to defeat the enemy at Normandy, but to be ready for Patton. This waiting imposed cascading costs. German forces engaged in Normandy fought without depth. Counterattacks were launched piecemeal, unsupported by the mass that could have made them decisive. Infantry divisions were fed into the battle without adequate armor. Losses mounted quickly. Replacement units were insufficient. Each failed local counterattack further weakened German capacity to act. Meanwhile, the Allies consolidated. Ports were improvised. Supply lines expanded. Reinforcements arrived continuously. What had begun as a risky gamble became a logistical machine. By mid-June, Allied strength in Normandy exceeded what German commanders believed possible at that stage of the operation. Yet the strategic picture in German headquarters remained distorted. Normandy was still treated as a diversion, albeit a costly one. The assumption that a second, larger landing was imminent at Calais justified continued restraint. Every day that passed without Patton's appearance reinforced the belief that patience was being tested, not disproven. This belief persisted even as evidence accumulated to the contrary. German commanders at the front watched their forces erode. They reported the scale of Allied buildup. They warned that the opportunity to contain the invasion had passed. Their warnings were acknowledged, then neutralized by the same logic that had delayed action in the first place. Releasing the 15th Army too early would mean falling for the deception. The cost of this fixation became measurable by the third week of June. Allied forces had expanded their beachhead, linked sectors, and prepared for breakout operations. German units defending Normandy were exhausted, understrength, and increasingly immobile under constant air attack. Only then did the strategic reality become unavoidable. The anticipated second landing never came. When German command finally began to redeploy elements from Calais, the decision arrived too late to matter. Movements were slow. Allied air power disrupted transport. Units arrived in Normandy fragmented and depleted, facing an enemy that no longer resembled the vulnerable force of June 6th. The consequences extended beyond Normandy itself. By allowing the Allies to establish a secure base in France, Germany forfeited the last realistic chance to influence the outcome in the West. The subsequent breakout, rapid advance across France, and collapse of German defensive lines all traced back to the same initial restraint. The 15th Army had preserved its strength for a battle that never occurred. In doing so, it ensured defeat in the battles that did. What made the consequence decisive was not the loss of a single engagement, but the loss of strategic initiative. Once surrendered, it could not be recovered. From that point forward, German forces reacted to Allied movement rather than shaping it. The name Patton continued to dominate German thinking even as Allied armies pushed east. Units redeployed too late, too cautiously, and too divided. The fear that had once seemed prudent now operated as a constraint, distorting judgment at every level. The battlefield did not punish Germany immediately. It waited. Then it collected its dead in full. By the time the illusion finally collapsed, the window that had existed on the morning of June 6th was long closed. What remained was a war of retreat, attrition, and inevitability. All of it flowed from a single decision to wait for an enemy who was never coming. The post-war record closed the case without ambiguity. When German commanders were interrogated after the war, their accounts converged on the same admission. The 15th Army had been held in place deliberately, not because of confusion, not because of logistical failure, because German leadership believed the decisive Allied blow had not yet been delivered. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff in the West, was explicit in his testimony. He stated that Normandy was regarded as a diversion for weeks after the landings. The expectation of a second, larger invasion at Pas-de-Calais dominated every strategic discussion. Until that threat resolved, the 15th Army could not be risked. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt echoed the same conclusion. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged that the delay in releasing reserves was fatal. He did not dispute that earlier movement might have changed the campaign's opening phase. He explained only why it did not happen. German command believed they were facing deception, not decision. That belief did not collapse quickly. Declassified German situation reports show that well into late June, senior headquarters continued to warn against stripping Calais of forces. Even as Allied troop numbers in Normandy exceeded initial estimates, intelligence staff argued that the buildup was intended to reinforce a feint. The real invasion, they insisted, would come with Patton. This fixation survived evidence because it aligned with prior assumptions. German planners had convinced themselves before the invasion that Patton would lead the main assault. Once that assumption was accepted, all subsequent information was filtered through it. When Patton did not appear, it was taken as confirmation, not contradiction. The Allied deception plan did not invent this belief. It exploited it. Allied records released after the war confirmed how central Patton's reputation had been to the deception effort. Operation Fortitude was designed not to create a fictional threat, but to reinforce one the Germans already feared. Inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, and staged headquarters activity were effective because they validated German expectations rather than challenging them. Patton's enforced sidelining after Sicily became a strategic asset precisely because the Germans could not accept it at face value. From the Allied perspective, the success of the deception exceeded expectations. Post-war assessments concluded that the retention of the 15th Army at Calais was one of the decisive factors enabling the Normandy lodgment to survive its initial vulnerability. This judgment was not speculative. It was based on German documents recovered intact and testimony from senior officers. The Germans had waited for an army that did not exist. When Patton was finally activated in August, commanding a real force in France, German commanders recognized the pattern too late. His rapid advance across northern France matched their worst pre-war assessments almost exactly. Speed, exploitation, and refusal to pause defined his campaign. What they had feared in June arrived in August, when it no longer mattered. In hindsight, German officers did not describe Normandy as a brilliant Allied trick. They described it as a failure of judgment rooted in overconfidence. They trusted their understanding of the enemy more than the evidence in front of them. They trusted assumptions over observation. The record shows no meaningful post-war dispute about the outcome. German leadership acknowledged that the decision to hold the 15th Army at Calais was a strategic error. They did not debate whether it occurred, only why it had seemed reasonable at the time. That explanation always returned to the same point. They were waiting for Patton. The war did not turn on the battlefield that morning alone. It turned in command rooms where belief substituted for confirmation, where reputation outweighed reality, and where a single assumption dictated the movement of hundreds of thousands of men. The documents close with no mystery left unresolved. The decision was made. The evidence was ignored. The consequences followed. The verdict is closed. The German defeat in Normandy was not sealed by courage on the beaches or firepower at sea. It was sealed earlier in a decision to wait. A decision made far from the fighting. A decision shaped by fear, habit, and misplaced certainty. 18 divisions were preserved for a battle that never came. They were not defeated. They were withheld. Their strength remained intact while the war slipped past them. When they were finally released, the moment that gave them meaning was already gone. The German command did not lack information. It lacked flexibility. It trusted its own expectations more than the evidence arriving hour by hour. It elevated reputation over observation. It treated Patton not as a commander, but as a signal. When that signal did not appear, reality was discounted. This was not deception alone. Deception only worked because it aligned with what German leadership already believed. The Allies did not invent the fixation. They exploited it. The system did the rest. By centralizing authority, German command eliminated initiative. By fearing deception, it guaranteed paralysis. By waiting for certainty, it surrendered the only time that mattered. The battlefield merely confirmed what the decision had already ensured. Normandy survived because German reserves were absent. The breakout succeeded because they arrived too late. The collapse of the Western Front followed not from surprise, but from delay. History records no counterargument from those who made the choice. After the war, they did not deny it. They explained it. An explanation did not change the outcome. The case ends where it began. A command waited for Patton. Patton was never coming. If this investigation clarified something you had not considered before, leave a comment. If you want to hear the next closed case, subscribe.